Darren, thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be back, and I'll be talking about something totally different. This is a passion project for me. Most of my work is in Central Africa, in the rainforest. I study monkeys, I study chimpanzees. I'm interested in how they find edible stuff in their environment, how they detect it with their senses, how they use their bodies to climb trees and acquire these edible resources, and ultimately how they digest them. I think most of the milestones of human evolution are in some way tied to the task of finding food. So in the process of that research, I happened to visit Egypt a few times on vacation with my family, for example. And I just noticed a few things that really surprised me compared to my experiences in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's how this project really started. So let me just show you a little bit of data from Mary Leakey. She published a book in 1983 where she surveyed the different types of animals present in rock art across Tanzania primarily. And then Patricia Vinicombe published a book in the 70s that was republished later in 2009 posthumously, where she surveyed the types of animals in the rock art of South Africa. And the key thing to note here is that giraffes in South Africa are the most common animal depicted giraffes in Tanzania are the most common animal depicted in rock art. And here, there's a very unfortunate printing error. These blue bars should be shifted down a row because it's the eland, far and away. Close to 35% of all animals in South African rock art are one species, the eland. Right? Giraffes are actually very rare with 0. So it's a really unfortunate misprint. But the key point that I want to bring home to you is that baboons, in the entirety of the Tanzanian rock art record, there are 4 baboons. So just 2 to 3% of the totality. And in South Africa, you have to shift down a little bit. There's 49 representations, and you can see the blue bar above represents, it's actually the blue bar should be down here. It's roughly 5 or 6%. So it's rare. That's my general point. Baboons are rare in the rock. Oops. Okay. Oops. Let me go back. Sorry. Okay. So here's an example of a scene with baboons. And there's a lot of baboons. There's a confusion of baboons. And you see people with weapons. You see clubs. You see bows and arrows. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. It's fascinating for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have 2 females with the infants riding on the back, jockey style we called it. And you can see forced perspective to give you a sense of distance. Here you have a female with the infant riding on the stomach, ventral. And that's a younger infant. So there's some really interesting biological realism. This is true. As infants develop, they switch from riding on the belly to riding on the back. But there's some conflict here. Here's a human with a bow and arrow. Here's a human with a club clubbing the baboon. So this is a really negative kind of interaction between humans and baboons. And the date is roughly 800 AD. So just over 1,000 years ago, long after farming had entered the region. So these are probably farming humans, not hunting the baboons, but they're in conflict with the baboons because baboons are major crop raiders. Here's another scene that is more telling. Here's the human with the spear, the baboon is fleeing. Here's humans in conflict, but now the humans have dogs. The dogs are even on leashes. These are really recent phenomena. So in other words, this rock art is not ancient, it's relatively recent. In the last few hundred years, after humans had adopted farming as their principal means of subsistence. So what we're seeing here is probably not humans hunting baboons, but humans chasing away baboons, or humans killing baboons because baboons are consuming their crops. They're a major predator of their crops. And this is telling. There's a woman, a professor named Catherine Hill in the UK, and she surveyed farmers about their actual crop losses to baboons. And this research was happening in Uganda. And it's a really poor reproduction of this figure, but you got percentage of the crop lost to baboons over these successive months. And you get 35% here in November, 35% in December. Maize crops, which are very important, upwards of 20, 25%. So in other words, a significant fraction of your crop is lost each month to baboons coming in and raiding the crop. And the frustrating thing for people is if elephants come and raid your crops, if chimpanzees come and raid your crops, that's somehow tolerable because it's understood that food is scarce in the forest and that the animals are desperate. So it's almost like a forgivable sin if they come in and take your food. But when baboons do it, it's just so much worse because baboons will come in and they'll take a corn stalk and they'll break it and just leave it uneaten. It's just destructive without the benefits of eating. And so this just drives people bananas. They really can't stand baboons. So here's a map showing the different species of baboons that we recognize. Some people would actually lump them into a single species, but most people would recognize 6 different species. And you see they have this distribution across sub-Saharan Africa primarily. And across this region of Africa, you have a lot of farmers. And inevitably, there's conflict, there's tension between baboons and farmers. So as a general rule, people dislike baboons. They're repugnant animals, they're harbingers of disease, they rage your crops, and you see, as a result, very few representations of baboons in local artwork. If you visit Africa, you'll inevitably find wood carvings or stone carvings of giraffes, of hippos, even buffalo. Lots of animals are represented in regional handicrafts, but also the kinds of handicrafts sold to tourists. But you'll almost never see baboons. There's a strong artisanal aversion to even representing them because they're so strongly disliked. And then the curious thing is if you go to Egypt, it's totally the reverse. Baboons are not only respected animals, they're revered animals. They're even deified. It's just that, like, it's such a surprise. Like, the cultural discrepancy between Egypt and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa is striking. And this is a really beautiful example of how baboons are represented. This is a pectoral, it's a necklace. It was found on the body of King Tut and Tutankhamun. And the more valuable jewelry was closer to the body. So there's multiple linen wrappings around his body, and jewelry was in multiple layers. And the best jewelry was closest to his skin. And this one was right on the chest. So this was important. And you have here, you have 2 animals. You have a scarab beetle or a dung beetle. In Egyptian mythology, dung beetles were important because they rolled a dung ball. And there was this view that it's kind of like the way the sun transits the sky. It's kind of like a giant dung beetle moving a dung ball across the sky. So dung beetles were strongly associated with the sun. And this is a solar disk associated with this dung beetle. Now, admittedly, dung beetles roll dung balls with their hind feet, not their forefeet. So there's a little bit of an anatomical mistake here, but we'll forgive them. Here are 2 baboons. And this is a very important necklace because it's showing baboons in association with 2 solar bodies. So baboons will raise their arms toward the sun. This is a very frequent posture we see in Egyptian myth and religion. And so the arms of the baboons are raised toward the sun. But on top of the baboons' heads is a lunar disk, a disk of the moon. So baboons were also strongly associated with the moon. And that's when they're seated in with their hands on their feet, their hands on their knees, with the moon above their head. So this is a very unusual piece of jewelry because it's simultaneously representing the association between baboons with the sun and the moon. It's usually one or the other, but not both. So here are some interesting examples of how baboons are represented through the entirety of ancient Egyptian history. From the pre-dynastic era, this is the oldest representation we have of a baboon. King Narmer's name is inscribed on the back of this particular statue, which is in Germany today. Here's all the way up to the New Kingdom. So the difference between here and here is roughly 2,000 years. And I just want to stress to you the similarity, the iconic similarity. They're both in a seated posture. Hands are in between the knees, but usually the hands are on the knees. And here you have that lunar disk associated with the animal. Here's from the Ptolemaic era. This is the Greek and Roman period. This is me for scale. This is an entire temple dedicated to the god Thoth. It's called Hermopolis in Egypt. And this has to be the largest, it weighs 35 metric tons roughly. It has to be the largest statue of a non-human primate in the world. This is a small little figurine. It's on display in the Louvre. It's been there ever since Napoleon brought it back. And it's a really beautiful example of a baboon with the lunar disk. So these images represent thousands of years, approximately 3,000 years of history, and a very strong consistency with the way baboons are being represented. But not only were baboons represented in art, they were actually imported into Egypt. Now, if I were to go back quickly to this map, I just want to point out this is Egypt here. Baboons do not live in Egypt naturally, and they never have. So, what's going on? Why were the Egyptians revering a species that they had no direct experience with? It just boggles the mind. So let's just go move forward. So at some point, they start bringing in live animals. They're importing them from somewhere. And here's some examples from a royal tomb. It was discovered in 1906 by an American based in Boston. He was a lawyer, and he was just independently wealthy. And he was buying concessions in Egypt, and he was digging around, trying to find things. And he was looking for King Tut, actually. And he never found it. He got sick, and so he sold his accession to Lord Carnarvon, who then hired Howard Carter to look for it, and he got it. He found it. I mean, it was the worst idea in the like, it's got to go down as one of the worst sales ever for this particular guy, because it could have been American who found it. In any case, he found this one tomb filled with animals, and we don't know who it belonged to by association. It was either Amenhotep or King Horem. This animal tomb was directly adjacent to both of their tombs, so it could have been one or the other. But in any case, they're both New Kingdom monarchs. And here you have 5 baboons. And I just want to stress to you, they're mummified extremely well, and they're in that seated posture, hands on the knees. They're all males, by the way, and the tail's always curved to the right of the animal. So there's a really strong consistency in the way these animals are being portrayed. Now, if you ever visit Egypt and you start to look for baboons, and I encourage you to do it because they're everywhere, you'll start to note some common themes. For example, if there's a large statue of a baboon, it's always facing east, always. It's facing the rising sun. And here's that same statue that I showed you earlier, facing that rising sun. And when you this is the mortuary temple of Ramses III. Here is an image of Ramses III, arms raised toward the sun, and behind him are 4 male baboons, arms raised. This is the posture of adoration, as it's called. If you go to the Temple of Luxor, right at the front, there are these 2, well, there's only one obelisk now, Napoleon took the other. But if you look at the base of the both obelisks, on the eastern side, there's these baboons. Again, they're all male, arms are raised toward the east, toward the rising sun. If you go here to Abu Simbel, this is a temple built by Ramses II, and these are 4 colossi of himself. And when you're standing there, you just can't help but look at these statues. They're just so immense and so impressive. And so it's really easy to fail to notice that above here, there's a colonnade of baboons. And again, the arms are raised, they're all males. And I just want to call attention to that guy, because that baboon's mouth is open. Now, this is sandstone. Sandstone is readily erodes. And so it's possible that you had erosion right there at the mouth and nowhere else on that animal or any other animal. It's possible. Or the artist who carved it is deliberately trying to convey a vocal behavior, a vocalization of this animal. And so much has been made about that open mouth on that one baboon at this one temple. And one of the most interesting Egyptologists to work in the 60s and 70s was a woman who did her PhD at the University of Chicago. She was independently wealthy. She just really liked Egyptology. During the Second World War, she was almost certainly an American spy, collecting radio signals from the Italians. So she had this really fascinating life. And she wrote articles about Egyptology. And in one paper in 1979, she made the claim that the reason why baboons were revered animals is because they orient their bodies toward the rising sun. Like this is a natural behavior. And that ancient Egyptians would have witnessed this natural behavior. And it would have resonated with their own religious beliefs because ancient Egyptians also welcomed the rising sun. And so she makes this really fascinating connection between the natural biology of the animal and the religious beliefs of the Egyptians to explain this curious connection between ancient Egyptians and this animal that did not live in their landscape. So Herman Tevelde, a few years later in 1988, extended this idea a bit further to say not only do baboons orient their bodies toward the rising sun, they also vocalize. And that this inscrutable vocal behavior of baboons, Egyptians would have thought that maybe the baboons were communicating with Ra, the sun god, and that this language was important. And so the Egyptians would have wanted to know what it is that the baboons are saying to the sun god Ra. And so you have these two Egyptologists knowing nothing about baboons or baboon behavior are making some really interesting connections between baboons and Egyptian religion. Added to that is some really puzzling work by a South African who fell into a troop of baboons in South Africa. I don't know what that means, but he writes about the origins of religion because every religion on earth has strong connections to the sun. And he makes the argument that baboons would welcome the sun, that they showed this, what he called ecstasy, and that this was a natural reflex to this magic, the magic of a sunrise. And that he thinks that all religion is rooted into this rapture of seeing the sun. Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst in Uganda, reaches the exact same conclusion that the origins of religious beliefs and spirituality can be traced to baboons welcoming the rising sun. So, is there any work on baboons orienting toward the sun? No, not at all. It's not a question that even interests primatologists, but it interests psychoanalysts, people interested in the origins of religion, it interests Egyptologists, and yet there's no data to address any of this. So I want to show you now a bit of video, and I'm not sure how the sound will reproduce. It's a BBC video showing you the Hamadryas baboon. We know exactly which species of all the species the Egyptians are depicting. And I just want to show you this animal. It's living in the cliffs. So this is the Awash Valley in Ethiopia. It runs on a north-south axis. And the baboons preferentially sleep on the western escarpment because that is the escarpment that sees the sun first. If you were on the eastern escarpment, you'd be in shadow. And so the baboons sleep at the top of this escarpment and they orient their bodies toward the rising sun. And just, I want you to see the posture, right? This is a male baboon, hands on his knees. So there's just like the biological realism of the statues is really impressive. So just want, this is the rift system. Africa's rifting apart. And the baboons will sleep up here. There's no sound. And I just want you to see what males look like versus what females look like. There's a big size difference. We call it sexual dimorphism. Some grooming behavior. There's that seated posture. Here they are at the top. And then when they warmed up, they drop down into the valley floor, and that's where they feed. So you sleep at the top of the cliffs, and then you feed and spend most of your day at the bottom of the valley floor. But this distinctive hair on the side of the face is something that the Egyptians are representing. Okay, I just want to give you a visual image of what these baboons look like in their natural habitat. This is in Ethiopia. Now they're dropping into the valley floor. Okay, so this is an extremely rare photograph. It shows what's known as the Sun Sanctuary. It's right next to Abu Simbel, but with the building of the Aswan Dam, there was flooding in this area. And so what they did is they took apart this sanctuary and they split up and they distributed bits all across Egypt into different museums and different parks and things. But this is in the middle of the cliff, not at the top or at the bottom where it'd be easier to build. This is recessed into the middle of the cliff. So it's the square-shaped area with these two obelisks, and you have these baboons on pedestals, arms raised, facing the east toward the rising sun. So why, if you're an Egyptian, why would you put it in the middle of the cliff? It's the most inaccessible part. It's just the challenge of it is just boggles the mind. Unfortunately, it's gone now, but I just want you to see that the connection between the baboons and the sun and cliffs is extremely strong.
When did they get rid of it?
Sorry?
When did they dismantle it?
It was the 1920s, 1930s, I think. That's a great question. It's whenever the dam was built. So all of Abu Simbel was also moved at the same time. Okay, so why do primates face the rising sun? Well, there's one species that's really famous for doing it. It's this ring-tailed lemur from Madagascar. and it does a lot of sunbathing, is what we call it in primatology. And most primates, they're moving on all four limbs, and so it's the back that is facing the sun. So for most primates, there's more melanin on the backside. But in this species, it's the reverse. The skin in the belly is black, it's dark. And so there's even the shifting in melanin to seemingly warm up the belly. And so here's some data to show the percentage of observations when they're sitting there in this kind of yoga pose facing the sun. It's between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. It's much more common than, say, 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. So it's happening in the morning, right when they wake up. And you can predict. So this is on this x-axis is temperature of at night. And so colder temperatures over here, this is the minutes they spend sunbathing. You see there's a negative relationship. So when it's cold at night, they spend a lot more time in the morning facing the sun. So they're trying to warm up, right? They've had a cold night and they really want to warm up their bellies, probably for food, for digestion. So you have bacteria in your stomachs that are responsible for digesting food, and they have a thermal optimum. So there's an optimal temperature for them to digest food. So we think what's happening is if food is going undigested through night while you're sleeping, then you need to warm up your bellies, warm up your bacteria so that they can digest the food better so that you can move on and get more food, right? It doesn't make sense to get more food, fill your stomach if you're still undigested food there already from the previous day. So we think it serves a digestive function. So let's just say, like, okay, even if those Egyptologists are right, even if Papio-hamadryas, that's the name of the species, has a greater propensity for sunbathing, there's this burning question, okay, where did the Egyptians actually see this behavior? Like if they actually witnessed real behavior, where did they do it? And we have some interesting clues. So here's a painting from inside the tomb of a noble. This is from the Valley of the Nobles. And this is showing tribute to the pharaoh at the time. And you see this beautifully rendered giraffe. On the giraffe is a monkey. You have ivory here. You have ostrich eggs and ostrich feathers. And you have a baboon here on a leash. And it's clearly Papio-hamadryas. So these animals we're told these animals come from a place called Punt. And Egyptologists have been arguing for well over 100 years about where Punt was. Here's Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. And it's an amazing place. I strongly recommend you go. And if you go up on this middle level, there's these huge reliefs that are so large that I can't easily show you photographs of them. So I'm scaling them all down to show you this line drawing. And what's being represented on her walls, this bottom, so in Egyptology, you read from bottom to top. So this is showing the Egyptian ships arriving at Punt. This middle register is showing the loading of goods, valuable resources being loaded onto the ships. And then at the top is that envoy that went to Punt. Traders have arrived in Egypt, and now there's a procession delivering those goods to Queen Hatshepsut, including a leopard up here. You have incense trees, live incense trees. You have cattle, shorthorn cattle, including baboons. So I've gone ahead and bolded, I filled in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 baboons are being represented as animals that have been acquired in this place called Punt. By the way, there's some important milestones here. Here's some kind of squid-like cephalopod thing, and here's some kind of lobster shrimp-like thing. These are the 2 oldest invertebrates ever depicted in human art. Now, one of the really curious things about these boats is their shape. So this is the ship in cross-section. This area above the water is known as the freeboard. In Egyptian ships, the keel had not been invented yet. So all Egyptian ships had a rounded bottom, which make them very unstable in the water. And so the absence of a keel in this very shallow draft means that there's a high propensity for rolling. And so it's been argued that these ships are so poor, nautically speaking, that there's no way that this water being shown here is the Red Sea. And it's more likely that this water is the Nile. And maybe these ships were going down the Nile. And so some people have argued that Punt was probably in Uganda because the quality of the ships was so poor. So that argument, what it failed to recognize, I'll just go back a slide, is that the Egyptians had these long oars, and it was an oar on either side of the ship. And so those two oars actually stabilized the ship. And so nautically, they were actually pretty good. They could sail the Red Sea, and we know this for a fact because people have actually gone and built scale replicas of those ships and sailed them down the Red Sea, so they can handle it. But even more impressively, archaeologists found the port on the Red Sea, and it was a stela that says this is the port where we would sail our ships to Punt. So, like never in the history of archaeology had there been evidence that so strongly refuted this idea. Like now we know, okay, certainly they sailed on the Red Sea. And the crazy thing is they build their ships on the Nile, test them, and deconstruct them, carry all the bits over to the Red Sea across the Eastern Desert and reassemble the ships. Right? Just the magnitude of the logistics is just really difficult to comprehend. In any case, this is what it looks like today. This is where the ships were kind of in dry dock. They found ropes, the archaeologists did, they found these ropes, and the ropes they looked like they were made yesterday. The linen and flax is just so perfect. And then what's more is they found in the scene, they found boxes buried with the paint intact. And the paint was painted by the tax collector. And here are the hieroglyphs, and it says the tax has been paid on these marvelous goods from Punt. So it's just like, oh my gosh, the quality of this evidence is just so terrific. So we know for a fact Egyptians could sail the Red Sea and that they were going to Punt. That's unequivocal. So here's just flipping back to Queen Hatshepsut's temple now. Here's one of the reliefs. Here's a house in Punt, very curious house. The house is on stilts, and then there's this ladder entering the house, very strange. This is a tree. This is only one kind of tree this could be. It's called a doum, D-O-U-M, palm, doum palm, because it's the only palm tree that bifurcates at the base. And this palm tree is in fruit. So, and then you have the shorthorn cattle. The Egyptians really valued these shorthorn cattle, presumably because they were arid adapted. In any case, we get some tantalizing clues about culture, the plants, and the animals in Punt. And then, speaking to my heart, is here's an image of a doum palm. It's in fruit. Here's the fruits. And then here's a baboon climbing the doum palm to access the fruits. And they do it. Here's a photograph of a doum palm. And here's a baboon in the tree eating the doum palm. So not only are they depicting the plants and animals with accuracy, they're even depicting the ecological interactions with accuracy. It's just astounding. Okay, so here are the Egyptians and their ship returning to Egypt. They've got living incense trees here. Here's the rigging of the ship. And I know it's hard to see, but here is the baboon sitting in the rigging of the ship. And it's got this very large ischiocolosity, this kind of butt pad that we're familiar with in primates. I know it's hard to see. Here's the outline here, and there's the tail here. Okay, so let's just pause for a minute and summarize where we're at. So this is the map of Africa. This green area represents the distribution of one kind of baboon called the olive baboon. And this sort of lavender area represents the distribution of Papio hamadryas, the one that they're depicting in their artwork. And they actually meet right here in Ethiopia. You know, here's an inset showing you Egypt and showing you where we found mummified baboons. We found them in a place called Saqqara, Tuna El Jebel, and we found them in Luxor. And then we've also found them at a site called Hierakonpolis, which is much older than the others. And I'm going to return to that a little bit later. So now we have the different species. Here's the olive baboon in green, Papio hamadryas, the sacred baboon here in red. And this is showing you different periods when we find them. So the olive baboon we find very early, at the very origins of farming, and we find it very late when Egypt is ruled by the Romans and Greeks. And then there's this very short window during the New Kingdom period when we get this animal, the hamadryas baboon, the one that's being depicted in art throughout the entire history of Egypt, but it's only being imported during a narrow window. What's being shown here in purple are known expeditions to Punt. So Egyptians went to Punt for 1,000 years. It's a long time. And typically when the Egyptians wanted resources, they went to war to get them, but not with the Puntites. They sent ambassadors and diplomats to Punt. So this is the origins of international peaceful commerce in human history. It's the first long leg in what would become the maritime spice route. So many scholars point to these interactions as the beginning of economic globalization. So the Egypt-Punt relationship is terribly important in human history, but where was Punt? We don't know. This is a major problem. Okay, so I mentioned Sahara. That's a Roman and Greek site. And I just want to show you some pictures because I actually got to go into this catacomb. It was super cool. And these photos are rare, so I'm just going to show you. There's these long galleries, and inside the galleries are these cut squares. And what would happen at this period in Egyptian history, priests would raise baboons. We have some written evidence of a husbandry program, a baboon breeding program run by priests. They would raise the animals, kill them, mummify them, and sell the mummy to pilgrims who would then put the mummy in this niche and pray to it. So it was it was an industry. And the mummies would go into these boxes, these wooden boxes, and go into the niche, and you would pray and leave it. But at some point, around, we think 200, 300 AD, Christians came in and just ransacked the place, broke open the boxes, threw the bones around. So it's described as a religious fervor. And so archaeologists, when they found this catacomb in the 1970s for the first time, they just gathered up the bones from the floor and just put them into the niches. And so it's just this, like, from someone like me, that's a gold mine of data and information right there. They also took the better specimens and put them in crates, and they just left them there. They're still there now. There's no space in the museums. So the best thing to do is gather stuff, archive them, record them, collect data, and just leave them there. So this is from the 96 expedition. So the catacomb was discovered in the 70s. It was a major expedition in the 90s, and then research stopped. And I just want to point out, this is how they were mummified. And you can see bits of bone inside. This is a big difference from those earlier images, those amazing images where you could see the hair and skin intact. Those were royal mummies. That was high quality mummification. This is a fast and sloppy job. It's not very good. Here's another tomb from that same era, but it's a different part of Egypt. And this was really nice because the baboon was put inside this niche. You actually had the name of the animal. It had its birth date and its death date. We know it lived 37 years, which is a really long time for a baboon. But there was an altar here for candles and food provisions. So these were individual animals that were respected. And again, I just want to show you how they were mummified. It's a whole wrapping. Those amazing images I showed at the very beginning, every arm is wrapped, the tail is wrapped, individual elements are wrapped. It was just more care was given to it. This is just doing it quickly and hastily. Different, 1,000 years apart, very different style. So let's just talk about baboons for a minute. I think they're amazing animals. I study them, I research them, but they have these formidable teeth. They don't make very good pets, and there's a few reported cases that it's never intentional, but humans have been bit by baboons. It's not, baboons are not aggressive to people, but sometimes if their two males are fighting and the human gets in between, a human can be bit by accident. But they cut human thigh to the bone. So a single bite will cut your thigh muscle to the bone. They're really, those teeth have a incredibly sharp edge on the posterior part. So they're very dangerous. So it's not an animal you necessarily want to interact with in your home. And so these are the two mummies that I focus my attention on. They're both at the British Museum. And I just want to point out, in this specimen, there's no canine teeth. They're missing. And let me go back. This animal has the distinction of being the first animal to ever be X-rayed. Because the people who invented X-rays in London, they wanted to practice. They wanted to calibrate their X-rays on something that wasn't a human before exposing humans to the X-ray. And so they x-rayed that animal. And look, there's no canine. There's a big gap right there. So the Egyptians were prudent. They wanted to remove these canines, these dangerous canines. So yeah, just to show you that absence of canine. So this is what a skull should look like. This is from that 1908 publication showing you the x-ray. So it was published 10 years after the x-ray was taken. So what it should look like. So long canine tooth, and it goes into the maxilla. There's this massive root here, and the bottom one has a massive root in the jaw. And there's the mummy. I'll just go back. This is my photo, and then this is that same animal photographed with its mandible. You see there's no canines, and look at the atrophy. The bone has collapsed into that empty socket. And I can tell you that happened long before the animal died, because the bone has filled in that socket. So it survived the removal of its teeth for some years, and bone filled in the empty socket. So this creates a problem for isotopes. It means that if you were to use hair to try to determine a chemical signature of their origins, it wouldn't help, because hair grows so quickly that the hair would reflect its life in captivity in Egypt. So you really need to get at the teeth. Teeth are important because they developed in utero. They develop as an infant in the mother's belly. And so luckily, this specimen had a few tooth fragments. And the British Museum allowed me to sample those tooth fragments and measure strontium-stable isotopes. Now, strontium is part of the bedrock. It erodes out into the soil. And then when water mobilizes that strontium, it gets into plants and it gets into animals in a given place. So if you were raised here in New Hampshire, you're going to have a strontium value that reflects the granite bedrock of New Hampshire. If you were raised in Vermont, you're going to have a different strontium value because that bedrock is schist. Like, the Connecticut River Valley is a fault. So the bedrocks in New Hampshire and Vermont are totally different. So you could detect that using strontium isotopes. And so here are some data to show you the strontium values of humans from different parts of Egypt at different periods. And this gray area represents the bedrock of Luxor, what used to be called Thebes, right in the center of Egypt. So this is Theban bedrock right here. And these dashed lines represent all the rocks that the Nile River might collect on its route. So it's the valley itself, all the sediments that mobilize into the river and flow down the river. And so what I want to point out is that most people look like Theban bedrock, which is what you'd expect. If you've lived your entire life in Egypt, you should look like these values in the gray zone. These are bone samples from the catacombs in Saqqara. These are the ones we think were raised in captivity and mummified for pilgrims. And the data strongly support that. It looks like their entire life was spent in Egypt. This guy, however, the one that was mummified during the New Kingdom period, that's the bone. By the way, you replace your skeleton every 5 years or so. Your bone is constantly changing, but your enamel stays the same. The enamel in your mouth right now is the enamel you had when you were born. So the adult teeth are forming their enamel for the first few years of life. Then you shed your deciduous teeth, and then those adult teeth come in. So the molars teeth, the first molar looks like it has the strontium value that you had when you were about 1 to 2 years old. And so this animal, looking at its molar enamel, is well outside of Egypt. So this was an exciting result. This meant that this animal was foreign. It grew up, it was born somewhere else, and was brought into Egypt, and it died in Egypt. And so what we did is we collected a bunch of hair samples and we measured oxygen values, and I'll just move on because those data were so noisy, they didn't yield much. These are different baboons from different regions that people think might have been Punt, and we can measure their strontium values. And then we can look for matches to that animal from Egypt. And I've drawn a black line around the entire area that is a pretty close match to where that mummified animal came from. And so we think that this specimen in the British Museum came from somewhere in this red zone, which very conveniently corroborates many hypotheses about where Punt was. We think the Egyptians were able to travel all the way down the Red Sea to this area. Now, granted, that's kind of a big geographic area, but still, we can rule out places like Uganda. We could rule out the Arabian Peninsula. Some scholars have even argued for Mozambique as being the location of Punt. We can rule out some of those competing ideas and zero our attention onto this area. So, postscript. That was a study that was published in 2020. It was really exciting. And then I decided to do more because this other mummified baboon came from this Valley of the Monkeys, it's called. It's right, if you go to Egypt, it's right between the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. There's two valleys adjacent to each other. In the middle is the Valley of the Monkeys, so called because there were 17 monkey specimens, mummified specimens, found in 1853, but they weren't actually excavated until 1905 by a French team. And so all these specimens are in the museum in Lyon, France. The date is much younger than the ones I was talking about. It's between 700 and 500 BC. And so, but these samples had DNA. And so these are the results we published in 2023. These are the DNA samples of baboons across Africa. Here's Papio hamadryas, and we can match the DNA of those animals to different populations of Papio hamadryas. And we're matching it right here to an ancient site called Attalus, which historic records show that the Ptolemies, Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III, they traveled to Eritrea, to Attalus, to collect baboons and other to collect war elephants and other kinds of animals, including baboons. So this was such a cool study because it corroborated our isotope data at different points in time, and it corroborated the written historical record written by Greeks about the travels and research in the Red Sea period during this time, during classical antiquity. So that was exciting. But now we have two different lines of evidence, different animals giving us a place, modern day Eritrea. Near the town of Massawa is the modern name, the ancient name is Attalus. It looks like this was a place where Egyptians were getting their baboons. But let's go back into deeper time. There's a site called Hierakonpolis, and it's an important site in archaeology because this is the transition. This is when people shifted from hunting and gathering food to farming. And once you start farming, then you become sedentary, you create villages, social stratification happens, and then it's off to the races. Then you get complex societies emerging from that. So the origins of the Egyptian civilization can be rooted to this site called Hierakonpolis. And the reason why we think farming started is because it was getting very arid, and people were abandoning parts of the landscape where they could herd their cattle and goats, and they were all congregating in the Nile Valley where it was still lush. The problem is human density becomes so high that you can no longer sustainably hunt and gather and engage in pastoralism. So you have to shift to farming. So at that same time that people were starting to farm, we see foreign animals come into play. We have a zoo in quotes, a burial site with a lot of animals. The earliest cats, like the shift between wild cats, domestic cats are here. Elephants, there's 2 elephants buried there, and a bunch of baboons. And they weren't mummified, by the way. They were simply buried in the sand. But the preservation is so good that we think that maybe the Egyptians got the idea for mummification because of this practice. Animals, people would be buried in the sand, and then they would erode out. And you're like, oh my goodness, they're well preserved. And so maybe mummification became a deliberate practice after this. In any case, these baboons are extraordinary. And I just want to show you about them. So Hierakonpolis is way over here. So Thebes is up here. Thebes is up here, right? And then you have the Nile Valley. There's this big bend here in Sudan. Khartoum is here. Right? Here's the border between Egypt and Sudan. Here's Libya. Here's the border between Libya, Egypt, and Sudan, and Chad. So 10 years ago, Egyptologists were right here. It's an area called Gilf Kabir. It's famous for the movie The English Patient. I don't know if you remember that film. There's like a cave, and there's rock art in the cave. It's an amazing scene. It was filmed here. In this site, they also found hieroglyphs. and it sent an electric shock through Egyptologists because the hieroglyphs say that it was an Egyptian expedition, and they're on their way to Yam, Y-A-M, Yam. And people were shocked. No one thought the Egyptians could cross the open desert this far. To go from the Nile Valley all the way to here was a shock. And if they're on their way to Yam, that implies that they're going still further. So where would they be going? This is open desert. Were they going to here? Look, this is a plateau known as Tibesti. Baboons live there, by the way. Or were they going down here? This is another plateau called Ennedi. So now people are thinking maybe one of these two places is Yam. And the other really important thing to note is that there's a fossil river. You can kind of see it in the satellite image. You see this, like this fossil river here? Today it's called the Wadi Howe. Wadi meaning dry valley. But in Greek times, it was called the Yellow Nile. And it was a tributary of the Nile. It was draining the Sahara and contributing waters to the Nile. And it was the third largest tributary to the White Nile, was this Yellow Nile. And now it's completely dried up. But the thought, and by the way, the rock art in the Nile Valley is identical to the rock art here. And so a lot of prehistorians think that there was biocultural exchange happening in this direction, that people were moving back and forth using this river valley to exchange ideas, animals, language, art between these two regions. And so it stands to reason that maybe baboons entered this region from the Nile Valley, and that maybe Egyptians witnessed these animals, and that the reverence for baboons that came later is just a cultural memory of their interaction with baboons here. It's a wild idea, it's a fringe idea, but it's exciting to test. So I want to show you what the Ennedi, I was just there a few weeks ago. This is what the Ennedi Plateau looks like. It is extremely arid, but the baboons sleep up here and then they go down to the bottom of the valley where there's vegetation. This is what it looks like. There's nothing to eat up here. But they sleep up here, we think, because it's safe from predators. There's hyenas here, there's cheetahs here. But by the way, there's crocodiles in the water. And the Egyptians talk about Yam as being a place where there was crocodiles and baboons. And so I went there, hoping to find dung samples to study DNA, to see if I could connect the baboons in Ennedi with those from the Nile Valley, but potentially those in Tibesti. And it's the size of Switzerland, but here, let me just go back. This area here is the size of Switzerland. So it's just massive. And the idea of just rolling up and looking for baboons, I just thought, well, this is crazy. It's never going to happen. But I got lucky. So that's a dung sample. I was very excited to find this dung sample. By the way, you can't confuse baboon dung with any other animal. It's so obvious. And so I ended up getting about 35 dung samples. They're high quality DNA. I don't have results for you yet. They're at the sequencer now. But I just want to share with you, I'm just so excited that we have DNA about to be processed, and hopefully we'll get an answer soon. There's an image of one of the animals. So I found them, was able to start to follow them a little bit. And what I wanted was their bones for strontium. So I found a skull. And I'm so pleased with this photo because the baboons, after they got accustomed to me, they started to watch me. And this photo, I didn't know it was being taken at the time. My colleague took it, but it's just kind of powerful. They're watching me collect the bones of their, not ancestors exactly, they're probably fairly recent, maybe a decade or two old. And at the end of the day, I found bones of 17 different animals. It's been about 2 weeks. No shower for 2 weeks. I was fantasizing about pizza and ice cream, but it was such an amazing place. And I got samples from all of these bones, and I don't have an answer for you because they're at the mass spectrometer now being analyzed. But hopefully I can come back another time and tell you the results. And maybe the Egyptians were getting their baboons from China. That would be a really, really cool finding if it's true. So I just want to say thank you, but also I want to thank these funding organizations, the Wintergren Foundation in New York, the American Research Center in Egypt, the Packard Foundation, NSF funded a large part of this work, and then the Council for American Overseas Research Centers, which is operated by the State Department. And I'll just stop there and invite questions.
I'd like to share that someone in Zoom wrote, "Many thanks, Mr. Dominy, for this presentation. Fascinating. Hope there are more."
Okay. Anytime, Jared. Let me know when you have an empty spot and I'll help them.
Are there any non-human primates in Egypt?
No.
None.
Just go back to so non-human primates they might get up to about here. So we have baboons that live in the Nile Valley, but south of Khartoum. So there's no non-human primates in this Nile Valley here, and none in Egypt. And there's no record of them either. So there's no bones, there's nothing, no fossils. It's just a big black box. So the only non-human primates we have in Egypt are the ones from temples and tombs. Like they're archaeological animals, not wild animals.
Is it because of the desert part of it, or
Sorry?
is it because the desert part of Egypt?
So that's the prevailing view is that the only reason baboons can hang on here is because there's permanent water. So they got trapped here. So the idea is that the Sahara, 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was green, and baboons would have entered these spots, and now they're marooned. Now they're trapped. They can't get out. They can't cross this desert. It's just far too arid. They can survive in these places because there's permanent springs called geltas, and they're drinking the water every day. They're water dependent, obligate drinkers, we would say. And they are consuming dune palms. That's the primary fruit available to them. So I think they have this incredibly monotonous diet. And you take away the dune palms, or you take away the water, and they're done.
Is there any evidence that they were used as guard animals?
There is, in fact, there are a few artistic depictions of baboons on leashes as police animals, like protecting market. A market stall might have fruits, and you might have a baboon to protect anyone from stealing your fruits at the market. Baboons were also, there's a few depictions of baboons climbing fig trees and gathering fruits on their own leash. So they might have been used as work animals to some extent. But that's it, just an artistic record, no written record at all.
Is there a book coming?
A book?
A book about this whole thing?
I don't know, maybe. I mean, Dartmouth incentivizes me by, so I write papers, and that's how I get pay raises.
Yeah.
So there's not much incentive to write a book, but I would love to. But no, I just write papers.
Are there a lot of other people that study baboons besides you in Egypt, or is it just kind of you?
It's just, I mean, Egyptologists might, but they're not that interesting to Egyptologists, but yeah. So I was telling Jared earlier, let me just find, just want to find a picture. Okay. So, before I do that, let me go back to Thoth. So the god's name, everyone knows that, like in Egyptian gods, right? There's a falcon, there's a jackal, there's a hippo, there's cats, right? Different gods are embodied as animals. So it's the moon god, Thoth, that is embodied as a baboon. And so it's the only member of the Egyptian pantheon, the only animal member of the Egyptian pantheon that is not native. Like every one of those other animals lives even in Egypt today. So the baboon is the big exception. And so Thoth is funny because I just want to get back to the map here. This one. So, okay, so Darfur, Sudan is right over here. And so Thoth is such a curious word. It's not an Egyptian word. It's a loan word. It's borrowed from somewhere else. And so linguists have been trying to figure out where the Egyptians got this Thoth word for a long time. And just last year, there was a paper that pinpointed it to this region, Darfur. And you know what it means? It means moonlight. It's a color. And I was so thrilled to read this because it means you could potentially measure the color of their hair and show that it's very similar to moonlight. And maybe the reason they deified this baboon and not other versions of baboons, right? There's other species. But maybe it's because of its color. That's why it became the exemplar, the animal exemplar for Thoth. It's because it's silvery white in color. And then that's a testable thing. So I went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and I got out the skins for different baboons, and I measured the spectral reflectance properties of their hair, and guess what? This is the one that's closest to moonlight. Yeah, it's confirming the obvious, I know, but it's kind of cool. So,
Interesting that they're then associated with both the moon and the sun.
yes. And maybe that's what made it so compelling, right? Is if you can link it to the sun and the moon, then it's like the best animal of all, maybe. I don't know. Who knows? There's this journal called Time and Mind, which is about the psychology of archaeology, like the psychology, like inferring psychology in the archaeological past. And so I want to write this up for that journal. I think it's a perfect fit. Yeah, Jerry.
Marianne on Zoom is asking, were baboons' organs removed during mummification?
That is a terrific question, and I don't know. I assume so, but I don't know. Yeah, that is a great question. I don't know. If she might be thinking of the different canopic jars, right? There's 4 canopic jars, and one of them is a baboon, and that's the one for the lungs. So when humans were mummified, the lungs went into the baboon jar, which is something that Herman Teveld noticed, that maybe it's because of the vocalizations, like maybe the lungs are associated with expelling air. And if the baboons are vocalizing toward the sun, then that makes perfect sense to link the baboon to the lungs and store the lungs separately. I don't know, but yeah, sorry, I just thought of that, but no, I don't have a good answer for her. Sorry.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.